I'm Michael Keller. I'm an investigative reporter at the Times. I have the pleasure of working with Rich Harris. I also make graphics and do various kind of data journalism things, and want to talk about chart making and a project I've worked on as kind of a side project for, which is weird to think, like 3 years making charts. That started out as D3 based, and then did a Svelte 2 version and just finished the Svelte 3 version. So kind of talk about both the problem of chart making and then moving it into Svelte and kind of the cool things that Svelte both does as a library, like handling the state and reactivity that made it a really cool choice for this type of problem, and also like the component API in Svelte that also made it really nice to just build charts in this way. Does anyone, chart making is not what everyone does, but who has made charts and things generally? Okay, cool, that's pretty good. So I'll start with like some history of the problem that I was trying to solve, and so this is, I guess, is around 2015 or so. Started like getting like a pattern of like, all right, charts are tedious, and we would generally build things in D3, and we would start. I'll show some code. It's mostly just about structure as opposed to syntax. So I think showing too much code would be very boring. So this is a general basic line chart, and kind of the background for making any chart is you've got an extent to your data. And your values go from 1980 to 2000, and then whatever other y values go from some other thing, sort of thing. And then you measure the DOM container and its width and height, and you map your x extent in your data to the width, and your y extent in the data to the height. And it's like pretty much the whole thing. And when you think of it that way, it seems pretty simple, but it's like really annoying to do over and over again. And it was compounded by the fact that you'd see all these like examples online where they were in blocks, if you're from the D3 world, and you'd say, oh, that seems really cool. But it wouldn't have any of the architecture to be updated when you resize the screen, which would just get really annoying. And so you'd see this cool example, and it works in blocks, and you try and copy it into your project, and you're like, okay, I actually have to re-architect all this stuff and identify all the things that are going to change when I update versus the stuff that's going to render, and what clobbers, what updates, what mutates. And it was really annoying. So like this is a basic chart, and this is kind of what you would get off of blocks. So we're just setting up some basic global variables, which is also the pattern, which wasn't great. Within your load data callback, you're measuring the extent of the data, your y extent, your x extent, setting that on your scale. This is your little line generator, and then you make the path. Pretty simple, it works. But the issue is, you open this up on its own, and you try and resize it, and it doesn't resize. And I remember I was talking to someone on our graphics team who was really, in my previous job, who was really into doing things in Illustrator, and they were kind of getting into code. And they did this really cool kind of lollipop chart, otherwise known as like a Cleveland dot plot chart. And they were super proud of it because they did it, and they were like, okay, Michael, can you help me make this responsive? And it was like 4 hours, and they were just like, all the enthusiasm for using this new tool just drained out of them. I was like, this is really annoying, because this is essentially what you do. This is the same chart, and you can see it's more code, and this is what you have to do to make it responsive. And so you have like, here's our load data callback, and we're setting like chart data, because again, it's like global was kind of the paradigm here. You like bake your chart, which like renders the chart, then you like set your values, and these are all various things of like same stuff, like measuring the data, measuring the extent of the DOM. Render chart is the thing that actually is touching the DOM, drawing it all. You have to think about all this stuff, and it's annoying. And it's like, all right, on resize, do the on resize function, which you set the values, you render the chart. And it was just like this, I know how this works, and I don't want to do it every time. And so I think that's a good opportunity. It's like, that is great for a library. I'll take a step back. So this is great. It's like, great, I want to make a charting library. There are many different approaches to this, and I think most of them, well, not say most of them, but I'll say there's two. There's kind of like the low level, which is what is kind of the D3 way, where it's like, here's a bunch of utility functions and scales. and scale sprint just being the heart of any chart thing, kind of have at it, do it, you end up with this situation where you have to manage the architecture yourself as a user. Or you have the kind of like, anyone remember high charts?
Yeah.
Kind of like dates myself. Yeah, like high charts, or like the Vega paradigm, where it's like, all right, I just want to say like scatter plot. Because it's kind of insane to like do all that for just a line chart. These are like pretty basic chart forms. You should be able to get some data, say I want a scatter plot, and you get a scatter plot. The problem then is it's very rare that you just have a chart that you reuse the same over and over again. There's always going to be like a little fiddly thing. There's going to be like label placement needs to be done dynamically, done special, or like the x-axis ticks need to be different. Like no matter how many times everyone's like, we have a style guide. There is no style guide for x-axis ticks. It's always different every time. And so if you do that kind of like very high level, high charts or Vega scenario, you end up with kind of like this spec where it is kind of very like I'm just typing out some JSON, but you have to learn. This is like I think a grammar graphics implementation. All of this very specific vocabulary and concepts. Like what is a series? What is a tick? What is a mark? And it's really neat because you can get into it. But then when someone is telling you, oh, can you just like make a little tick in between the year to kind of show each month? You're like, okay, I need to translate that into the language of the spec. And that I find just even harder because like, I'm kind of like, well, why did I learn all this thing? I can just know how to write a loop and I can place that on my scale. So I didn't want to do something that was super high level as that, which is what a lot of the charting libraries were. Any questions so far?
Show us.
Yeah. Trying to go back to my thing here. Okay. So that's kind of the first two issues. One, low level is kind of tedious. High level, you lack customizability. The third issue we run into in the newsroom, we're building things on deadline. You have to decide, really at the beginning of the project often, what kind of technology am I going to use? Is this going to be like an HTML? Because like if it's a column chart, you can just do it in divs. That's totally fine. Is it going to be SVG? It makes sense if you have a line. But then you're like, all right, this is an SVG, and then I have a little label for my line annotation, and then an editor comes up at the last minute and they're like, actually, we want this different label that's like 10 more words, and it needs a line break. And you're like, oh, I have to implement like line breaks and SVG for mobile and all that, and your editor, of course, doesn't really understand like why a line break is so hard, and like to their credit, it really shouldn't be, but it is. So I was like, I want to build something where those changes in language I can abstract away a little bit, so that if someone says like, all right, we actually need a ton more data, and I think I should render this in Canvas as opposed to SVG, I can do that more easily, and I'm not working on, all right, I can kind of do it, but I need to make like a Canvas overlay that matches my D3 margin conventions, and that type of thing, which I'd done for a few charts or just graphics, and it was fun and cool. I thought this could also be a way we can just kind of eliminate some of the differences here. So I ended up building Layercake, which is layercake.graphics. You can check it out. I'll just show, this is a little bit of the API. The idea is that the library itself uses Svelte stores and Svelte contexts to do all of that scale handling. It measures the extent of your data. It measures the target div that your chart's going into, does the scale for you, and then because these are all stores and reactive, you get all that resizing for free when the dimensions change, which is, number one, like a great thing and works really well with the Svelte reactivity. The second part is the Svelte syntax of the component. So you can see here we import a Layercake component from the library, and then it exports these SVG, HTML, and Canvas wrappers. The idea was that it would be really declarative. I didn't want to repeat myself that much. So when the main thing you're declaring is kind of like the X and Y accessors for your data. So if your data looks like this, you tell it, all right, get the X dimension off of X, Y dimension off of Y, here's the data. And then you can use the built-in kind of layout wrappers, or what they're called, to put your components in there. Now, one key thing is you'll notice the axis, the line, the scatter, the labels are not part of Layercake. those are components that live in your own project and are really up to the user to build. And that's because I think building libraries is fun, but maintaining libraries is really hard. And so you also lose that customizability. So by putting all those, like, you can't really build the end-all be-all scatter plot component that's going to work for every project. So don't even try and do that. The user can start with a little bit of sample boilerplate, I can show what that looks like, and then just start building off that to make it custom for them. So I'll show you like a basic scatter plot. And then because all of the coordinate systems are synced between the SVG, HTML, and Canvas, it makes it really easy just to kind of move between them because you can add as many of these overlays as you want. So this is the main one. So this is an SVG scatter component. You use the Svelte get context function with the keyword Layercake. And so you get your data, and you get this xget and yget function. And so this is really just what the starting scatter plot component would look like. Xget goes into the data and grabs the x key from your accessor, and then also applies your scale translation. It also exposes just the accessor and just the scale if you wanted to use them separately, but most often I use them together. And in a lot of D3 code, you see this just nesting of x, D, x, x scale, and I get confused. Is x the x scale? Is x the accessor? So it just needs to be one. Most often that's the case, but if you need them as separate, there's an escape hash. And then the other thing, so building it in D3 was all right, but you didn't have this great. I think it's really nice to be able to start composing graphics like this, because then from project to project, you can start reusing them more. You have a common starting point for each of them as your jumping off point. You're going to customize, but you can start just kind of composing them, and it feels just much nicer. It's also nice because in Svelte 3, the exports are really cool, and that was one of the big changes from going from Svelte 2 to Svelte 3. I used to have this options object that was kind of annoying, and it was still a JavaScript API. So in this new version of Layercake, it's all as a component API. So you can start to build kind of this canvas scatter component, export the R and the fill color, and you have kind of what's a pretty good beginning of a reusable scatter plot component. And it uses internally D3 scales. So you say it is expecting either an X, a Y, a Z, or an R accessor. You kind of get 4. If there's a use case for more than 4, let me know. It seems like 4 seems to be enough. And uses D3 scales internally. You can pass in your own D3 scale, your own scale, as long as it has actually I think it's pretty open, as long as it has a domain and a range method on it. And the idea was I wanted this to be maintainable and just bite off as much as I could chew. And there's so many different use cases that D3 scales comes up with that I don't want to have to fit into my head to do ordinal scales and all that. So it's designed to work there. And I think that's pretty much it. And then so Rich is going to present on a similar charting library, which is really cool, and gets at some of the SSR issues that I hadn't thought of with this. And then we'll talk about some of the I think they're very compatible, some really cool techniques that he's thought of. And yeah, any questions? We'll do questions at the very end. So yeah, on the website there's more examples that show some interactivity. This is one that shows kind of the idea of you can have a canvas background if you don't want to waste DOM elements on visual elements that don't need interactivity. Whereas SVG is much easier to do hover stuff on than Canvas. So that's a use case for where you want to mix the two. You can do swoopy arrows, some other kind of tooltips. Voronoi, that's that Cleveland dot plot. Animating, so this is when you want to switch between the domain of the specific data versus a global domain, and then some kind of other interactivity within it. Yeah.
This is super cool. So all the implementation for all these examples is not coming from the library. You're just coding it yourself.
Right.
Do any of them use D3 in user land? Can you do that if you wanted to get the data reactively and then have it like run D3 code every time it changes?
Yeah, I mean, it's a Svelte component, so whatever goes in that is totally up to you. Yeah, it uses the the Layercake slots. So it's just going to plop whatever goes into your component into that wrapper.
Gotcha.
So if you wanted to run some SVG stuff, you could have your own little SVG thing here.
Cool.
And I think I have some examples. I think this one has for the line generator. This one is using just constructing the line manually, but I have some in here that use D3 SVG generators. I mean, this is all using like D3 projection.
Right.
So that's an example of like D3 Geo, making the projection reactive, and I built this one. I tried to build the examples on the website of thinking of like, what's a pretty good generalizable example? So this one kind of lets you pass in the projection name as an export. I think, yeah, the area uses the D3 shape. And also imports just a D3 scale to do the ordinal stuff. That's using the area generator.
Very cool. Yeah, as someone who's worked with a lot of these libraries, I think there's a lot of wisdom in just taking on the data part, and like you said, basically taking off the rest of the user land. So.
Yeah, I think this kind of is like just like the nib of the pen,
right?
Because that's really what you want to. You want to worry your time around like what is actually touching the DOM, and then Svelte does a great job of just handling the reactivity for you, and then those wrappers just kind of give you some escape hatches of what format am I using this in, and the margins. So you do the SVG, and then like the axis bumps off the edge, so it uses that like D3 margin convention.
Have you used it at work?
Yeah, I've used a version of this sitting next to Rich. Rich makes great graphics, so I've only had to make a couple charts, that is. But let's see, I used, what was the headline of the Chan story? Yeah, the YouTube one and the Chan story. Flourishing business. YouTube views. This was a story I did that I did the charts for. This was the Svelte 2 version, which was like, oh, Michael, you're running this story, by the way, also make the charts for it. And that was about 6 or 8 months in or so to the job. I was like, I want to learn Svelte. So I was like, all right, let me try and port the D3 Layercake into Svelte. And it worked really well. And so these are Layercake ones, which was really nice because you could start, building it up. Like they all share the line component, but the color gets passed in as a prop, so that's reusable. Again, it's small multiples, so that's really lends itself well to the component style. And then there's like, that line is one layer, and then the annotation and the arrow is another layer. So it was nice to compose it in that way. Fighting the good fight, that was it, right?
Yeah.
This was using what I learned was a not well-written and buggy version of Layercake 3. These are all Rich's awesome graphics. And then I made this very plain chart. But yeah, so those are two. This isn't the version that is now published because this version is not as good. But yeah, the globe is much cooler.
But that chart down there is made with Layercake.
Yeah.
So that's pretty custom. Like if you try to do something like that with high charts, like it would just be a disaster.
Yeah, totally would be able to. Yeah. And there was stuff in this where this was a little bit of a challenging. It's a pretty simple chart. I guess that is a sign of a good one where it's kind of a challenging data set, but a very simple visual. But we had some data issues where you can see the y-axis is over 150,000. And so we had some months where it was very, very small, but we still wanted that to show up. So it wasn't like a pure mapping, so we kind of had to set a base, a floor of like 1 pixel. And so similar things where if you want to use like D3 path generators, like the defined method is really useful. Where it's like if I don't have data, or like here's a function that will tell you whether to draw data. You run into stuff like that all the time, even if it's a very simple chart format.
Would logarithmic chart work better for that?
Logarithmic charts are really difficult, I think, for readers to understand.
Okay.
And I think the visual effect of this was we wanted to show the massive increase, so the narrative would have been a little counterproductive if it was flatter. It's always really challenging when you get a data set that has those huge differences. And I think, I think you can talk. There was a log scale for some of the coronavirus stuff that you were. I'm not sure if you were involved with that. You can speak to logarithmic scales in general and make a decision on that one. But yeah, it's tough.
Just wondering, like, it seems like kind of high stress, like you mentioned all these deadlines. Do you need to have like a fallback option if whatever you have in your head doesn't work, or are you just that good?
Chart-wise, I mean, like the first attempt never works. I don't think you just kind of have to cobble together stuff that eventually does. But I think it's kind of like a high stress often yields a good result because you have to constrain sometimes what you want to do, which in the end crystallizes it. Because at the end of the day, it's all about kind of telling a specific story and a really clear story. And so that kind of like, all right, we really need to get something there. How do we boil it down to that really simple idea?
Just one last question. So like this example where you do the annotated column, it's kind of what you were talking about where like you want to use HTML to render text. So it takes care of wrapping. Right?
Exactly, and I should have pointed that out because that is one of the real things that I wanted to do is like SVG chart, HTML does text really great. Let's throw the HTML in there. But again, this is like it gets complicated really quickly because you have an SVG layer for the column, a text layer, and then arrows. And the way I wrote this arrow, I don't even call it a library, but the arrow component in here works really, I don't know if declaratively is the right word. I don't know all the definition of these words. Y'all are better programmers than I am. But for me, working, and take a step back, there's also a lot of people that do Illustrator style, like charts in the newsroom, which is great. Why I've gravitated more towards the code approach is I do better when I just kind of have to do things in one area, like one spot, and then it cascades down, whether that be I'll make the chart once and then it can work for mobile, as opposed to like let's do 3 different charts for different widths, and it's like, all right, there's a misspelling in this annotation, now I have to change it across 3 files. I'm much worse at the latter problem. So what I designed for this example was the arrows attached to the text, the HTML text. So you can move the HTML text around and the arrows will follow it. Because I always get annoyed when it's like, all right, I want to change the arrow, I want to change the text, which is constantly changing until another publication, and then I got to change the arrows again. They got to follow it, and it's like, I don't like that. So then you not only have the column SVG layer, we do those separate layers. You have the column layer, the HTML layer, then the arrow SVG layer can read from the HTML annotation layer and kind of cascade down. Which for me, I like better, and it's kind of cool to have that only be done in one place. But yeah, so it's pretty simple. All that to say, it's pretty simple, but having it in those different components helps.
You're saying if you change the text, the arrows would just stick to the edges of the.
Yeah. So I kind of wrote this little thing here where the annotations you define in this JSON object, and again, this is all outside the library. This is just however you want to build your components. You define where that text is based on percentages, and then it has an array of arrow objects, which can be clockwise. The source attaches to these options. You have a dx and dy, so you can fiddle with it, so you always need to fiddle with it. And you apply the target. I think you can apply the target in percentages or pixels, I think is how I ended up doing it, but I think pretty much always do it in percentages. So this one has 2 arrows coming off of it.
Very cool.
And so this is an example. The only difference if you're used to like the D3 margin convention is I renamed it to padding because margin just didn't really make any sense. Like the CSS padding paradigm is much closer to it. And then it's normally a linear scale, but you can pass in your own scale. So for a column, you may want to do like a scale band or whatever. You can pass in your own. If you want to overwrite any of those built-in kind of measuring the extent of things, you can pass in your own custom ones. This was a feature I often found, like for the line chart is a good example of this. If you want, for the area, obviously the y-axis you want to set a hard floor at 0, so that actually is showing it from 0, but you still want to get that automatic extent calculation, so you can say set the y domain at a floor of 0, but null for the max. max, and then it will just take what it reads off of your data. So I built in some things that for me as a user, I want to offload as much of that automatic calculation, like if the library can calculate it, let it do that, and then me as a user, I'll just kind of add in a little bit of custom things that I need.
Cool.
Thanks.
I'm just going to use the same screen recording.
Yeah.
Okay,
Makes it easier.
edit it later. See if I can turn off that sound.
I think you just have to shut Discord.
Yeah, it's probably actually
Browser Discord.
Svelte. Yeah, the Svelte Discord. So this Game of Thrones thing that Michael pointed out earlier, I think it was the first thing that we did with Svelte at the New York Times, and you can tell that it was done in 2017 because Daenerys is still in the good quadrant. Although you go back every few months and she's shifted a little bit to the left as people keep filling out the survey. Okay, so today is not just Svelte Society in New York City, it's also happening in London today, a worldwide Svelte meetup extravaganza. And in a couple of weeks, it's going to be happening in Russia as well. And the organizer of the Russia meetup asked if we could record a video to set things off. So,
What do we say?
it's alright. I'll
What's Russian for hi?
Yeah.
Yeah, привет.
Привет.
Привет?
Привет.
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 Well, that means hello.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
Okay.
I see it.
Okay, so I will say in the video, I'll say on behalf of Svelte Society, and we'll all say Privet.
Привет.
Okay. Hey there, it's Rich coming to you from the Microsoft headquarters in the middle of New York City. There's no windows in this room, so you're just going to have to take my word for that. It's the 4th Svelte Society New York. It's been really incredible to watch the growth of the Svelte community in Russia, and it's awesome that you're having your first meetup under the leadership of Pavel and others in the community. So just want to say from everyone here to everyone there, Privet!
Привет! Nice.
All right, thank you. So the other day, I posted a blog post about this charting library that Michael mentioned. So what happened is a few months ago, before the new version of Layercake came out, I was tasked with building some charts for a story that Michael was working on, which was what delayed the release of Layercake in the first place. So our bank of desks at the New York Times has a very high ratio of Svelte charting libraries to people. And so I started from scratch because Layercake didn't yet work with version 3. And I came up with a charting library that does a very tiny fraction of what Layercake does, but it just has one clever trick which I felt was worth putting into an NPM package and releasing, which is that Pancake, the charting library that I'm talking about, can render charts that don't actually require JavaScript to run in the browser. And what I mean by that is that we go to the website, the Pancake website. So this is an example of a Pancake chart, and we've got like a little tooltip here that shows the data, shamelessly ripped off from Limbo. But if I were to disable JavaScript, then it would still work. We don't get the tooltip anymore, but the chart itself is still visible. The data is still visible, and this chart is totally responsive and all the rest of it. If we had some responsive CSS on this, then that would also work. It's just the JavaScript that's missing. So this is a good example of something that is being progressively enhanced. And the same is true for the other example charts that we have here. I can't click these buttons, and I can't use this filter here, but the chart itself does work. I'm going to re-enable JavaScript so that I can show you what they do. So this is population pyramid chart. You can see that back in the 1850s, there were way fewer people, and then you kind of see here that there's more men than women in their 40s and 50s, in the 30s, and then at a certain point around 1970, all of a sudden that flips around. There are now, like, as you get older, men die off a lot sooner. I'm not exactly sure why that is, but it's kind of interesting to see that actually kind of
Fewer deaths in childbirth.
flipped around. Is that so? Okay.
Probably.
That's a pretty good hypothesis. Yeah, so it's interesting to see how that's flipped around between 1930 and the present day. And then this life expectancy chart. We've got some interactivity here where it'll find the nearest point to where the mouse is and then highlight that line. And we can filter for a specific country like that. This is the kind of thing, like you saw that Vega chart configuration earlier, that giant blob of JSON. Like, you can't imagine trying to do all of the little micro interactions and customizations that you can so easily do with JavaScript through a component library using some sort of configuration type approach. Because it's Svelte, we can also do nice motion and transitions and stuff. All of that without having to put that in the charting library as well. I'm not going to talk too much about how this works because I covered it very briefly in a previous Svelte Society, and also I've written this blog post. So if you are interested in how it works without JavaScript, then it's all written down there. One last thing I'll say about this, I'm actually using the same technique in a mapping context. We're doing these charts at the moment tracking the outbreak of coronavirus, and these charts need to work on mobile and on desktop, like that. Completely responsive. But it also works without JavaScript. An earlier version did use JavaScript, and it meant that the first thing that you saw when this page came to life was this. Like, you would see some text, and then you would see a header, and then you would see a footer, and then you would see some more text. And you had to wait for like all of the analytics code and the ag code and the comment code and all of that to get out of the way before our JavaScript would run, and then D3 would load, and then we would load some geodata, and then we would construct a map and put it into the DOM. But now that we're using this JavaScript free technique, as soon as you load the page, the map is already there. So it's doing a better job of conveying information to our readers. That's enough to talk about charts for one night. I wanted to make some announcements about a tool called Degit, which is not technically part of Svelte, but it is what it's what you see when you first visit svelte.dev under the Getting Started section. npx degit svelte.js/template my Svelte project is how you start a new Svelte project by default. npx, for those of you who aren't familiar, is a tool that downloads and executes packages from npm. So Degit is a thing that you could install globally, and you can just type Degit svelte.js/template my Svelte project. But npx means that you don't have to have it installed globally, and whenever you use it, you'll get the latest version. Svelte.js/template is the repo on GitHub where this project lives, and then my Svelte project is just a new directory. So this is, to my mind, the simplest possible way that you can scaffold a new project. And it's a little bit different to how this stuff normally works. In React land, you have create React app. In Vue land, you have Vue CLI. Angular has its own CLI as well. And this is how most front-end frameworks handle project scaffolding, is by having these sorts of opinionated tools. And there's a few pros and cons to doing it that way. On the pro side, you can be extremely opinionated when you're building tools like this. You can have all sorts of nice error messages, give the user lots of good feedback. After you've created a project, like we create React app, you can then maintain it later. If there are updates to the project template, new version of Webpack, whatever it is, then you can add that even after you've made changes to your project. You can do things like add new routes to your app if you're using the Angular CLI. And you can have wizardy style interfaces where it'll ask a question like, are you using Sass? Do you want to use Babel? And you can say yes or no, and it will configure your project accordingly. But there are some pretty concrete downsides as well. there's a lot of complexity. There's a lot of stuff that you need to try and learn and understand in order to deal with these CLIs. The tool itself is under constant pressure to encompass more responsibility. Like a lot of people will be like, why doesn't Create React App use TypeScript? So the CRA team has to consider adding TypeScript, and then it just becomes this ballooning thing of like addition after addition after addition. The third one I think is crucial. You can't make your own templates. My idea about how to create a Svelte project might be very different from yours, and if you need to do something equivalent to Create React App or the Angular CLI in order to customize these tools, then I think that's a pretty major downside. And the last one, you're going to eject anyway. The point about being able to update stuff after you've created it only applies until you eject from the project, which is the thing that happens when you need to add some customization that the tool did not anticipate, and then you just turn it into a regular project and then start editing it. And at that point, you can no longer use the tool to maintain your project. I prefer a much simpler approach, which is just clone a Git repo. And from that point forward, you can't make any changes unless you want to faff around with the Git history, but you're probably not going to need to. So Degit is a tool which allows you to clone a Git repo without also cloning all of the Git history. And it's faster and it works offline, and there's less to type because you just need to type npx degit svelte.js/template instead of git clone and then a fully qualified git URL and then like -- depth equals 1 or whatever to stop with the history and everything. And it seems to work pretty well. There are some downsides to this approach, but it does seem to work pretty well. The reason I'm talking about it tonight is because as of today, there's some new stuff in Degit which will make it nicer to start a new Svelte project. Firstly, faster installation through bundling, and I can demonstrate this here. So if I were to do npx,
Can you make the font bigger?
yes I can, npx Degit Svelte. Hang on. 2.6.0, so that's the last unbundled version. You see it took 3.274 seconds to install there, and then if I get the most recent version, hopefully this is going to work. Yes, it did, okay. Except I need to do. Okay, so way faster to install, and the reason for that is because Degit no longer has any dependencies. Instead, all of the dependencies are def dependencies, which means that they get bundled into the package, which means that you're only requesting one thing from NPM. You're not requesting one thing and then requesting all of that thing's dependencies and all of their thing's dependencies until you've got the entire graph. There's just one blob of JavaScript that takes care of the whole thing. It also works with private repos, thanks to... Yes?
You still have to cd in and yarn install or whatever, right?
Yeah, so if I go into that, that directory, then I would still need to do npm install. Which is
I was gonna say, because if you solved npm install in 1 second, man, I'd be all, I'd become your new preacher right here.
Yeah, and honestly, we could probably make the project template a little bit simpler so that we're not having to do any of this no jip stuff. Oh, God. That took 20 seconds.
Well, my first thought, sorry, I can ask about another thing.
No, keep
Keep going.
Well, I was just quickly going to say, like, my first thought when I saw this was it's a good way to, like, if you want to reproduce something, like, if you wanted to, like, maybe not even for projects, but, like, let's say you want to create a Svelte starter or something that people could create to reproduce an issue before opening an issue. It seems like a really good way to do that. And what if you could, like, cache the node modules there? So it's basically just a really easy way to get that on my computer, and I can reproduce my issue, upload it, and then, like, post it.
Yeah,
So
so
as an open source maintainer, I have the same problem where people don't. It's hard to get people to reproduce things.
yeah, one thing that we can do with Degit is add what are called actions. This is where it gets slightly opinionated. And actions is actually a Michael Keller idea, where after you've cloned the repo, you can then do something like remove some files or add some new files. You can conceivably add like an npm install step there that would do that automatically. The way that it's implemented is it just goes and fetches the latest tarball for whatever you've specified, using the local cache if that fails for some reason. And then it's just extracting that tarball. So you wouldn't have node modules inside that by default, unless we change the architecture a bit. But it's definitely an idea. Yeah. So the other changes, it now works with private repos. It used to only work with public repos, but thanks to a pull request, it can fall back to using git clone. So if you have your own private project template, it will work with it. And perhaps the most exciting new feature is we now have an interactive mode. So I can just do npx degit, and it will give me a list of all of the things that I have cloned already in reverse order of how recently I used them. So because the last thing that I cloned was the Svelte template, I can just hit enter, destination directory. I can decide whether I want to use the cached version. I don't, and then off it goes. So cloning Svelte projects or creating new Svelte projects rather, just got a little bit easier. Again, thanks to a brilliant pull request from this person, Sato Taki, I guess is how they're pronounced. Yeah, that is it. New version of Degit. Hope you all like it.